It's showtime.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
You know, the right to bear arms is because that's the last form of defense against tyranny.
Washington is fundamentally corrupt. There are more words in the IRS code than there are in the Bible.
Made in America, heard round the world. You're listening to Blunt Force Truth. I'm Chuck Woolery, along with my co-host Mark Young, and we're ready to rock and roll.
Well,
Mark?
Chuck, don't get too ready because the world is going to come to an end in 12 years.
Well, that's right. Well, we have time today. What is it? What is it with the left that the world is always coming to an end? I mean, in Hollywood, it's like a constant theme of everything blowing up and people moving to Mars and Venus and Switzerland. I started to say
it's God, not Switzerland.
I know it's insane.
Hey, by the way, go Sweden because remember, I am the #1 death metal rock musician in Sweden.
Please.
So if we're going to go someplace, let's go someplace where I have an audience.
Yeah, right.
Regardless, the world is coming to an end in only 12 years. Now, my Ted Danson doomsday clock ran out of batteries waiting for the world to come to an end.
Your Ted Danson doomsday clock. You mean Ted Danson, the guy put on blackface and went to a party with Whoopi Goldberg?
That's the guy, yeah. Remember he said the world was coming to an end in 10 years? That was 25 years ago.
I'm going to do this show in whiteface.
Well, the world is coming to an end in only 12 years because AOC, Ocasio-Cortez, has determined it. Because there are all of these massive, big brain scientific people out there, Chuck, who are absolutely positive that we are destroying the planet through greenhouse gases.
Yeah.
And if we can only bring cows to a halt and stop air travel.
Well, I mean, after all, those dinosaurs sure did their damage, didn't they?
They did.
Talk about flatulence.
Yes. So we've got a great guest today. We're going to talk to Dr. Peter Ward. Now, Dr. Peter Ward has a impressive background, did his BA at Dartmouth, did his PhD at Columbia. So he's much smarter than you and I, Chuck, and that's good because we want to learn things.
Absolutely.
He worked for the United States Geological Survey, was a research geophysicist. He has done everything, and the good doctor has brought himself out of retirement.
Yes.
To save the planet, because we're going to be gone in 12 years, and he has decided that he's going to help bring some truth to the global warming debate. So, Dr. Peter Ward, welcome to Blunt Force Truth.
Well, Mark, it's a real pleasure to be here.
So, Dr. Ward, let me ask you something. The left is always saying, well, the weather has nothing to do with climate. And yet, every time something happens in the weather, they say, you see, the world's coming to an end. We have more hurricanes, we have more tornadoes, we have hotter climate, it's colder climate, but the weather has nothing to do with that.
Well, by the way, global warming is in full swing here in Detroit this morning. It's 9 degrees.
But anyway, how do you answer that? I mean, when they say the weather has nothing to do with climate change.
Well, weather is short-term climate, or climate is long-term weather. So drawing the line between them, it's really just a matter of whether you're talking about what's happening today or what's been happening over the last decade or century or millennium.
They never talk about what's happening today. They always talk about what's going to happen, 100 years from now.
Well, I think what's really interesting is in science, the goal is to get the truth.
Right.
The goal is to try to figure out what's going on. We observe nature, and scientists of different colors all try to figure out how nature works, and we go try to use that. And sometimes in science, you can head down the wrong alley, and it may take a long time to find that. But you realize at some point that you're down the wrong alley.
But what happens a lot of times, though, people run down that alley like you're talking, and they become so committed to that route that they can't turn themselves around, right?
Well, it's a matter of what you believe. Now, in science, believe is we use it data-based, but still, you're studying something, and you think you see this correlation, and you look at all these other things and they seem to agree, and you begin to believe that that really is the true explanation.
So this is a correlation versus causation issue.
Yeah, and correlation is not proof of causation. Every scientist knows that. But still, well, if we don't find any correlation, then we're probably not looking at what we need to look at. And in greenhouse gases, what has been observed is that greenhouse gas content is increasing and the world is getting warmer. So
and
there is correlation.
It is true. We're getting warmer, right?
It is true. We have warmed over a degree centigrade since 1970. There's not much question about that. All four major agencies that have analyzed the data agree. It's been about a degree centigrade since 1970.
Okay, so that should end the world in another 12 years then, I would imagine.
Well, the real issue is what's going to continue in the future. If you explain the warming that we've observed based on greenhouse gases, and you look at the emissions of greenhouse gases, you begin to project that 10, 20, 30 years from now, it's going to get really hot. But if greenhouse gas theory is not correct, then there's no evidence it's going to get really hot. And what I've discovered, we really go back to 2006. I discovered, very much to my surprise, that in the Greenland ice cap, in the Greenland ice sheet, when you drill down through and you look at the ice cores and you determine the temperature at the time it was formed, and you determine how much volcanism was going on at the time by how much sulfate there is in the ice core, you find that at the end of the last ice age, precisely at the time we warmed out of the last ice age, was the greatest volcanism recorded in Greenland ice. Now, all volcanologists know, and most climatologists know, that explosive volcanoes cause cooling. Mount Pinatubo, 1991. There was a cooling of about 0.5 degree centigrade for 2 to 3 years following that eruption.
Right, and just so people understand, we're talking about volcanoes, not Mr. Spock from the planet Vulcan, right?
That's correct.
All right, we won't do any live long and prosper things here, but so we're talking about volcanoes.
We're talking about volcanoes, and big explosive volcanoes cause cooling. We've observed that after every one of them throughout history. So when I see this data in the Greenland ice sheet that say, no, the major warming was a time of major volcanism, I said, wait a minute, how could volcanoes cause warming and cooling? And the more I looked at that, the more I realized figuring this out could be really important. And so back in 2006, I was retired. I decided to dedicate the rest of my life to trying to understand in detail how that could happen. And it turned out to be fascinating.
When a volcano goes off, it fills the atmosphere with ash. Is that what causes the cooling, because the radiant heat or the sun isn't making its way through the ash?
No, when the volcano blows off, it puts up a lot of water vapor in the sky, and it puts up a lot of sulfur dioxide. And sulfur dioxide and water vapor makes sulfuric acid. Mm-hmm. Sulfuric acid happens to agglomerate together onto particles very easily, and this creates an aerosol high in the atmosphere, in the lower stratosphere, 10, 15 miles up. This aerosol is little mist, little droplets, and the droplets get big enough to reflect and scatter sunlight. So explosive volcanoes cause global cooling by forming an aerosol that reflects sunlight and allows the Earth to get cooler. This is well observed and well understood. On the other hand, it turns out other kinds of volcanoes, like basaltic eruption volcanoes, like we see in Hawaii or in Iceland, they don't explode big things high up into the atmosphere. They just put a lot of lava out over the ground, and the lava emits a lot of chlorine and bromine. And that chlorine and bromine gets up into the stratosphere, and it depletes the ozone layer.
Right, so now, that is damaging, putting chlorine into the air.
Yes. And why the ozone layer is important is the ozone layer protects life on Earth from the hottest radiation from sun. Ultraviolet B radiation is what burns your skin, is what causes skin cancer. It's very hot stuff and very dangerous stuff. And thankfully for the ozone layer, most of that gets absorbed up there, warming the stratosphere rather than reaching Earth. However, when you deplete the ozone layer, which chlorine and bromine causes, then more of this ultraviolet B radiation, which is very hot, is received at Earth, raising your risk of sunburn, which is well understood, and causing Earth to get warmer. So non-explosive volcanoes cause warming, explosive volcanoes cause cooling.
So, Doctor, did we deplete the ozone layer when we were using traditional refrigerants like monofluorodichloromethane, stuff like that, R22, R12? Was that giving us damage?
Well, Mark, you're right on target, because that's the next major point. Humans depleted the ozone layer from 1970 to 1998 by producing chlorofluorocarbon gases, which are used for refrigerants, spray can propellants, foam blowing agents, solvents. And these gases became very, very popular in the late 60s. You could buy almost anything in a spray can in 1970. And then in 1974, scientists realized that these gases, when they get high up in the stratosphere, are broken down to release chlorine. And one little atom of chlorine can destroy 100,000 molecules of ozone. So with very little of this reaching the upper atmosphere, you can have a big change on the ozone layer. And that means more energy. If you deplete the ozone layer, less energy gets absorbed up there, more energy gets absorbed down on Earth.
Right, but we've stopped using these refrigerants, though.
Well, in 1985, we suddenly discovered the Antarctic ozone hole, and it was a lot bigger than anybody imagined. By 1987, scientists and political leaders at the United Nations had created the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. And what this protocol required was, starting January 1989, to cut back on the production of CFC gases. Well, sure enough, what we see is that by 1993, the increase in CFC gases in the atmosphere stopped. By 1995, the increase in ozone depletion stopped. By 1998, the increase in temperature stopped. So humans, by manufacturing CFCs, had caused the global warming from 1970, and they stopped the global warming through the Montreal Protocol by 1998.
All right, so we fixed it.
We fixed it. We caused it, and we fixed it.
I'm confused, because in the 70s, Newsweek came out with global cooling. They didn't say it was warming. They said we were going to an ice age. That's in the 70s, correct? I'm not wrong about that.
That was before we discovered we were having global warming.
Well, the interesting thing is that the temperatures really did not change much from 1945 to 1970, or not even 1975. So then they started increasing from 1975 to 1998. They didn't change much from 1998 to 2013. And then they started increasing at 3 times the previous rate from 2014 to 2016.
Now, is that because of the wide use of air conditioning started around the late 60s?
It was a wide use of the refrigerant Freon that was used in air conditioners,
R22,
refrigerators, all those chlorofluorocarbons. They're the ones that cause the problem. Plus, it was used in spray cans. Chlorofluorocarbons don't interact with much of anything. Chemically, they're very inert. So they were very useful because as refrigerants, they weren't as explosive as other refrigerants that were available. And as spray can propellants, they didn't interact with the paint or whatever, the perfume or whatever was in the spray can. So they got very popular. And we measure this increase throughout the 60s, but then it really got to be big in the 70s of CFC showing up in the atmosphere.
So with all of that kind of behind us, would you say, is it behind us now? I mean, we fixed the ozone hole and...
Well, we fixed the problem with refrigerants. We got rid of the type of refrigerant that was causing the problem. One of the things that's a little sidebar on those refrigerants, which I'm sure the doctor knows, I'll share this with Chuck, when you put flame to, monofluorodichloromethane, R22, it creates phosgene gas, which is what the Nazis used in the gas chambers.
Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, We caused the warming in 1970, and we stopped the warming by 1998. However, as I was explaining earlier, volcanoes also emit a lot of chlorine and bromine.
Well, we could tax them. Can't we put a tax on volcanoes? Seems like that would solve the problem.
I don't know if Vulcan would agree. But anyway, in 2014, it was a volcanic eruption in Iceland that most people didn't hear about. It was a Barðabunga volcano in central Iceland. And in 6 months, it covered an area the size of Manhattan, 33 square miles.
I remember that.
There was Eyjafjallajökull eruption in 2010, which interrupted airspace and caused everybody knows about that eruption. But 2014, the Barðabunga eruption, it didn't interrupt airspace. It didn't explode. It just put lava out over the land. It was the largest lava flow since 1783. Now, what we discovered is looking throughout history. Every time there's a major basaltic lava flow, at the same time, there's major warming. And this ranges from lava flows, for example, in Craters of the Moon National Monument in Idaho. The last major flow there was 200 BC, which was the Roman warm period. And that covered an area of about 700 square kilometers. And then we can go all the way back to 251 million years ago, when lava covered an area of Siberia almost the size of the United States. Just imagine basaltic lava going from New York to San Francisco to Miami to Seattle.
Could we get it to just cover New York and San Francisco and skip what's in the middle?
Well, it's a little hard to control lava. We've tried it many different ways, and it goes where it wants to go, despite the politics. So what we've learned, though, is that in 251 million years ago was the greatest mass extinction, the greatest warming. Oceans got to be hot tub temperatures, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the ocean. It got to be really hot. So what we've learned looking at the geologic history is that throughout geologic time, sudden warming was caused by big basaltic lava flows that didn't explode anything in the air, and very slow cooling was caused by these explosive volcanoes that cool the Earth just for a few years. But when you have 5 or 6 of those per century, they make the Earth incrementally cooler and cooler, so that over millennia, you could go down into ice ages. So what we've learned now is the footprints of climate change on the big picture, geologically, is you have sudden warming within years, followed by slow cooling over millennia. And this can repeat itself, but it's not cyclic. It's very erratic. It depends on when the volcanoes erupt and which kind of volcanoes are more active at any given point in time.
So what risk do we face right now then?
So the risk we face now, what we should say is what we don't face now, is the very sudden warming that's predicted by greenhouse gas models.
Well, now wait a minute. Let's back up just a little bit. We're talking about CO2, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Is CO2 a pollutant?
Stop breathing.
Well, I mean, it's what we're led to believe by every politician in the world, the UN and everybody is jumping on these CO2 is killing us. Is that what we have to worry about? Is breathing and everything that emits CO2?
Well, if you have 100% CO2 in the air around you, you'll be dead.
Well, yeah.
we need oxygen. But plants need CO2, and they use CO2 in greenhouses to make plants grow better.
Okay, plants breathe CO2, we breathe oxygen.
The history of greenhouse gases is kind of interesting, but all they really have to show there's a relationship is a correlation between an increase in temperature and an increase in greenhouse gases. And we see that correlation today with the greenhouse CO2, for example, measured at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. It's just been going up for as long as we've been doing the measurements. We see that correlation from the ice ages in Antarctica. You see every 100,000 years or so, it gets colder. The CO2 goes down in the atmosphere. It gets warmer, the CO2 goes up. But that can be explained simply by the solubility of CO2 in water. You all know that when you have a beer, and you're busy talking and you don't drink your beer, it loses the bubbles. The CO2 comes out. It gets warmer. Warmer ocean puts more CO2 in the atmosphere. Colder ocean absorbs more CO2 out of the atmosphere. So this correlation between CO2 and warming can simply be explained over geologic time as a difference in solubility of CO2 in the ocean, which is well understood.
When we say a correlation, though, I mean, to give people an example of correlation versus a causation, a correlation could be, every time I wear my lucky shirt, I win a poker game. That doesn't mean that the lucky shirt actually is a actual lucky shirt and it has any bearing on the poker game. It just means that it seems to go together, right?
Well, the way we say it is a correlation is not proof of, just because it's contemporaneous doesn't mean it's the cause. Correlation is not proof of cause. And what's interesting when you begin to question greenhouse gas theory, which I've been doing now for 15 years, almost when you look in detail at what you can say scientifically, it's not standing up. And I now have a website called physically-impossible.com, in which I show in just a very few words how it's physically impossible for greenhouse gases to cause the warming that we've observed. Okay. I just explained how CFCs cause the warming and how volcanoes cause the warming. So we have an explanation. Greenhouse gases cannot be that explanation. Maybe we need to talk about that.
So there are other scientists that agree with you, correct?
There are other scientists who question greenhouse gases as causing the warming.
Well, there are a lot of meteorologist guys that I've heard about that absolutely question it.
Oh, yeah. No, many of the weathermen on television aren't really supportive of greenhouse gas theory.
Well, you wouldn't know it by listening to them.
It depends who you listen to. Well, they vary a lot.
But you and them, the ones that we're talking about, I would say are in the minority of the belief category. But the problem is that we're told this all the time, that it's just the opposite. I mean, from Bill Maher on HBO doing his comedy show.
He's a great science mind, Bill Maher.
Well, I mean, to Bill Nye, the science guy,
another fake scientist,
to all of these people who are promulgating all of this information or misinformation. They are totally opposite of where you are, and they seem to dominate the news. Do they dominate science as well? I mean,
the vast majority of climate scientists are convinced that greenhouse gases are the cause of global warming.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I can give you a history of it, but basically in 1988, many scientists were convinced that greenhouse gases were the cause of global warming, and they realized that in order to convince political leaders to spend the billions of dollars necessary to prevent the emission of greenhouse gases, they had to demonstrate consensus. Now, consensus is the stuff of politics. Debate is the stuff of science.
Right.
But starting in 1988, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed for the purpose of demonstrating consensus in order to get the political leaders to spend money.
So
this was a political decision.
It was there to get consensus.
This was a political decision by the scientists done because they thought they were going to save the world by convincing the political leaders that this was a major problem. And they succeeded in doing that with the Paris Agreement in 2015.
Is there money?
The problem is the science has changed.
Is there money involved in this as a driver?
Trillions.
Not as a driver. It's really driven by a mistake in science that was made 100, 150 years ago. And when you go back and read all the literature from the point of view that I can now read it, I've been through over 10,000 papers in climate science, and there was a mistake, an honest mistake made long ago. So most of the scientists are convinced that the science shows that greenhouse gases are the problem. And now with this emphasis of building consensus, not only are they trying to say, well, look, we have this consensus, so it must be true, they're also saying anybody that disagrees with this consensus shouldn't be listened to.
Well, leaching
one of the problems
was
I've
one
had.
time a consensus at one point.
What?
Leaching for illness was a consensus at one point.
Oh, yeah. And there was a strong consensus that the Earth was flat. Mm-hmm. There was a strong consensus at one point that the sun revolved around the Earth. This is the history of science. You have consensus that builds, but then you have new data. And that's what a revolution in science is, when you suddenly discover what you thought was true isn't true.
Well, the fact is, for the greenhouse gas to be the cause of global warming, isn't that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't that mean greenhouse gas is somewhat of a perpetual motion machine?
No, that
it has the ability to generate heat?
No, the mistake that was made is that it was believed way back in 1812, Joseph Fourier said, look, the Earth is receiving a lot of heat from the sun and it's losing heat to space. If it loses less than it's accepting, it must get hotter. This seems perfectly logical. You've got a body of matter here and it's receiving heat and it's losing heat. If it's losing heat faster than it's receiving heat, it's going to get cooler. That seems perfectly logical. All scientists have believed that to this day. It turns out that's not the way heat works. It just doesn't work that way.
How does it work?
Heat is a function of the temperature of the body from which the heat comes. And the physical makeup of that heat, the physical properties of that heat from the sun are very different from the physical properties of the heat from Earth. And so what we know is that heat is a spectrum. We know that light is a spectrum. In a rainbow, you see the visible part of that spectrum. Heat is a much broader spectrum that includes frequencies from way down in the infrared, way up into the ultraviolet, and even more frequencies, but those are the most dominant. And the fact is that it's the change in that frequency content that makes something hotter or colder, not the amount. At the moment, we're talking about amount. Scientists calculate watts per square meter, and they say the sun puts out so many watts per square meter at the top of the atmosphere, and the Earth loses so many watts per square meter. You can't do that. You can't measure heat in terms of watts, although we do it. It's done to engineer things. It's done to understand climate. Well, what I discovered is that heat is something quite different. And in fact, I didn't discover it. In 1900, Max Planck, one of the fathers of modern physics, showed and wrote an equation that showed a body at this temperature will produce all these frequencies where the amplitude of oscillation at each frequency is equal to this amount. So Planck's equation calculates the amplitude of oscillation at every frequency of oscillation for a body at a given temperature. But this is where science has been confused. Scientists have argued for 2,500 years that light, which is the same thing as heat, just light is what's visible, travels by either waves or by photons. And any physicist you ask today will tell you, yeah, it's either waves or particles or wave-particle duality, as we say in particle physics today. It turns out that's simply not right. That's not the way light travels. Light travels the same way that this radio station communicates to the listener. The radio station emits a frequency. Your radio receiver is tuned to resonate at that frequency. It picks just that frequency out of all the other frequencies out there, and it increases the amplitude of that frequency, which is amplified, and that's what you hear on the radio. But for heat, it's doing this at every frequency simultaneously. So heat is frequency, and frequency is transmitted by resonance. And this is how thermal energy travels. It's how radio signals travel. It's how television signals travel. So frequency of what? Well, what we've learned since all this other physics was developed, we realized that matter is made up of atoms and molecules. I mean, it was not until 1907 or whatever that we even knew about the nucleus of an atom. And yet, as I said, Planck discovered all this stuff in 1900. What we know now is that the molecules that make up matter are not rigidly connected. They oscillate. The connections oscillate, and they oscillate at very high frequencies. And when you heat the matter, they oscillate at greater amplitude and at higher frequencies. And so it's those oscillations in matter that are a function of the temperature of the matter that are being transmitted through air and space and being absorbed as heat or being absorbed as a signal or being absorbed as light wherever you are receiving that signal.
I'd like to introduce you to a new type of podcast. And by new, I mean there's never been anything like this before, not in terms of scope or ambition. The show's called Living Beyond 120. Science proved that lifespan could exceed 120 years back in the 1960s. And the Bible first mentioned living to 120 years 6,000 years ago in the book of Genesis. But the question is, how do we get there? Living Beyond 120 tries to answer this question. The show is an exploration into human longevity and what it will take for us to live longer, healthier lives, featuring interviews with some of the most respected minds in longevity science and tackling big subjects like how the medical system, big pharma, and maybe even our own government don't want you to live longer. Living Beyond 120. It's hosted by me and my co-host, medical expert, Dr. Jeffrey Gladden. You'll find the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast directory, and you can also listen to it at the website livingbeyond120.com.
Now, I have to admit, from my point of view, I have no idea what you're talking about.
I was afraid of that.
But I must say this, the most disturbing thing that you've revealed during this conversation to me is that there are scientists who are renowned who are stuck in the past and refuse to move on no matter what evidence there is that they're wrong. They will not change their point of view. That's the most disturbing thing.
Let me answer that one for you, Chuck. It's called Keynesian economics.
Well,
how bad has Keynesian economics been disproved?
You know what? It's very interesting, Mark, and this is a conversation between you and me. So, Peter, you're part of it by virtue of the fact that while you were talking, I was thinking, you're Milton Friedman. And everybody else is Keynesian trying to, it's like, what a wall to come up against.
Right. He's an Austrian economics professor in a Keynesian world.
It was going through my mind the entire time you were talking.
There you go. That's exactly it is the answer to the question. Look how many people are locked into Keynesian economics, even though it has failed miserably, but they're locked into it as a philosophy.
They just will not change. Do you find that rigidness in your community?
Well, the more you go off into economics, the less I understand. But the human nature is that we tend to believe what we believe. And we may believe that on scientific grounds, we may believe it on some other grounds, but we believe what we believe and we defend what we believe.
But we expect more from scientists.
Well, when the scientists look around at all the other scientists and they all seem to agree too, then the scientist becomes afraid of standing up and saying that that's not the way it is. Now, I had the lead atmospheric chemistry scientist in a major government agency say to me, Peter, there is no way that you could be right and all the rest of us are wrong. And I said, well, can you give me a scientific reason? And he can't.
Yeah.
I've written to the leaders that have been the primary authors on most of the atmospheric reports that have been come out from the United States and from the IPCC, and I pointed out what's wrong, and they simply will not engage. They simply will not discuss. The fact is they are so convinced at this point, they've spent their whole life being convinced. They've written a whole lot of papers about it. It's only human nature that they don't want to change. And that's what makes the scientific revolution. The history of a scientific revolution is a whole lot of people begin to believe this. And when somebody comes along, and usually it's just one or two people, and says, no, look at this data. This is the way it really is. They don't want to hear that because they're defensive of their whole life's work.
I was about to say, you're telling somebody to throw their life's work away.
But you find these people in England taking thermometers and putting them on asphalt in order to prove their point. I mean, it's just amazing. They will.
It proves the asphalt's got a temperature.
Well, they will lie to prove their point. Just as
well, I don't. I think using the word lie is we got to be a little careful here. I mean, I think the wonderful thing about the human race is most of us want to do the best we can, and we want the people around us, particularly those that love us, to appreciate what we do. And I try not to attribute motives to other people. I can disagree with their science, and I can tell them why I think their science is wrong. But I'm not going to tell them personally you're lying or you're.
Well, okay, but let me say this, then I'll ask this question. Why would someone, to distort the truth, do something like put thermometers on black asphalt in order to make their point?
Well, I don't think
we know that it was done.
I don't think they're consciously distorting their truth. They're trying to figure out, they're trying to show what they believe. I mean, there's a number of experiments that claim that they show that greenhouse gases increase causes melting. Bill Nye, the science guy, and Al Gore have a famous one out on the web. And it turns out this showed what they wanted to show, except the experiment was wrong. They were using the wrong heat source. It did not go together properly. They honestly thought they were showing it. But to this day, no one has ever shown by experiment that when you increase greenhouse gas content, the air gets warmer. It's never been shown. And yet experimental basis is fundamental to science. Now, another lead scientist said to me, he said, Peter, if you're right, everything I've done in my life is wrong.
Correct.
Oh dear.
That could be.
That's hard to argue with. And in fact, he's a very close friend of mine. And we agreed several years ago that it was more important that we stay friends than that I convince him that he was wrong. And this was about a fundamental point in physics. It's very significant. Anyway, the fact is we got a lot of scientists out there who have spent their life, have spent decades writing papers, training other scientists, collecting data, doing a lot of great scientific work, absolutely convinced that the theory that explains what they're looking at is greenhouse warming theory.
So how do
I'm coming along and saying, wait a minute, guys, here are the scientific reasons why greenhouse warming theory is mistaken. And I go one step further. I can now say it is physically impossible.
But Peter,
to get them to listen is very, very difficult, and I've been trying very hard for a number of years.
So we are being misled by false science, costing trillions of dollars and potentially costing even more money. Forget everything else, but more money. Being led emotionally to the brink of destruction. And how do you turn that around?
Well, that's a problem I face every day. I mean, I was told
we're not on the brink of destruction, but according to them, we are.
We're not.
I was told 6-7 years ago by a good friend who's in the National Academy of Science, a great scientist, said, Peter, your volcano story is perfect. But he said, greenhouse gases, there is no way you will have any influence. The train has left the station. It's traveling at high velocity. And my response to that is, I cannot go to sleep at night knowing we're about to waste trillions of dollars without trying to convince the world that that's the case. And so much of my effort over the last few years has been publishing a book, publishing articles, doing over 100 radio shows, talking to politicians and staff up on Capitol Hill, moving in every direction I could think of, just trying to get the scientists to step back and debate the science.
Well,
what's frustrating is they won't debate. They just ignore.
Well, boy, I mean, I can think of
you can't debate.
Fall into that category. But the thing of it is that with politicians, as long as there's a way to make money off of this, you're never going to convince them. because
Well-
it's a money train for them, and they're not going to. I mean, from the UN on down, they can fleece the public and increase the coffers by.
Well, it's a power grab.
Well, what you're talking about really is capitalism. And the fact is that the way we survive in our environment is we make money by going along where we think things are going. The idea of greenhouse gases has gotten very well established, and a whole lot of people have changed their investment philosophy based on that idea. Now, when someone comes along and says, hey, that's not the way it is, either they want to shoot the messenger, they certainly don't want to hear that they've misinvested their money. With political leaders, they have to answer to both sides. And we've gotten in an interesting situation over the years where one party, if science gets in the way, they're happy to omit the science. The other party tends to believe science, tends to want to make a change in science. And in this case, unfortunately, the science turns out to be mistaken. So we've got this, we're in a hell of a mess right now, really.
Chuck, let me give you a couple of examples of what's happening here. There's a couple of things happening. One is called confirmation bias. And all humans have it. And that is, we look for information to validate our belief. So when we find one piece of evidence that supports us, we lock onto that like it's the Bible, and we take other evidence that disagrees with us and we discount it. We throw it away. That's part of what's happening with science. The other thing that's happening, which is another psychological model, which is called social proof. And what that is, the majority of people are willing to believe that the group is smarter than the individual. So when we see 100 scientists that are saying greenhouse gas is the deal, and we have one scientist or physicist saying that that isn't the deal, we tend to lean into the group. We tend to fall for the false premise that the group is smarter than a potential individual. Would you agree with that, Doctor?
Well, Max Planck, as I said, was a father of modern physics and got a Nobel Prize. Anyway, he said, new scientific ideas never spring from a communal body, however organized, but rather from the head of an individually inspired researcher who struggles with his problems in lonely thought and unites all his thought on one single point, which is his whole world for the moment.
All inventions, I'm going to say, when you get back to any kind of innovation or invention, whether it's electronics, digital, medicine, it almost always goes back to an individual or an extremely small group of people that are focused on a problem and find a new way to break through it. You are right. It never comes from a large body of people.
In my case, as I explained in 2006, I found this enigma, something that just didn't make sense. And the more I looked at that, the more I realized there was something interesting here. And I have dedicated my life since then. In retirement, I'm talking 7 days a week, 10, 12 hours, 14 hours a day. My only obligation has been to keep my wife happy, and she's been very understanding. And my kids are 1,000 miles away or more, so I see them off and on. But anyway, I've been working full time, and I don't waste a lot of time watching television and doing other stuff. I really enjoy digging deeply. I'm very tenacious. And the more I looked into this, the more it became clear there was a problem. And I can associate very closely with what Planck said because it has been my world. It has been my world now for going on 13 years or whatever. And it's all the way along, I've said, wait a minute, Peter, you're disagreeing with most scientists out there. The odds are you're totally wrong. Are you sure? And I've tried to walk that line. I've tried to keep an open mind to the fact that I could be totally wrong. But what I'm convinced now is somebody's got to prove me wrong, and I don't think they can do it.
What does this cost you? What does this cost you in the way of credibility, relationships, friends?
It's interesting. A number of scientists who used to review my papers privately as I was writing them have been long-term friends and have provided excellent reviews of my scientific work. Once I began to question greenhouse gas theory, they lost interest. I'm a well-published author, but ever since I started, any paper I've sent in questioning greenhouse gas theory has usually not even been sent out for review. They simply won't send it out for review. You know, it was Gandhi that said, first they ignore you, then they fight you. No, I'm sorry. It's first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. What's been going on for me is most people are ignoring me. And even when I'm in their face, they do their best to ignore me. And when I send a paper in for review, they won't review it. That's the way of ignoring it. That's part of the way life works.
So they're going to say they don't review it because you're a quack. But I say the reason they won't review it is because you're a danger. You're a danger to their thinking.
Yeah, I mean, we all make decisions every day about what is spam and what's not spam. In terms of email, it's easy to understand what spam is. But anyway, there are ideas that are worth thinking about, and there are ideas that we ignore. And if we didn't ignore a whole lot of ideas, we wouldn't have time to think about ideas. So one of the things all humans do is they make decisions every day about what is spam and what is useful, what they're interested in. And they develop their lives in that direction. The scientists are doing the same thing. They're just convinced, there's no way, Peter, you could be right and all the rest of us are wrong. And I'm saying, look, here's the data, here's the evidence, tell me what's wrong. And I can't get them to react. Mm-hmm. So what I'm saying is the crisis right now in climate is not in climate, it's in climate science. Mm-hmm. It's getting the scientists to step back and reevaluate the situation. The most important thing I want to do is get the political leaders to get the scientists to comment, to show where I'm wrong. If you think he's wrong and you're going to ignore him, you show where he's wrong. I've written it in many different ways. I've got published papers. I've got a book that describes it. I've got websites that describe it in infinite detail. I've got videos. I have sent email to over 2,000 climate scientists asking for interaction. I have a video on the web where I'm pleading to climate scientists several years ago to face the data, to step up to the data. It's now come to the point in the world and where we're getting in terms of implementing the Paris Accord and so on, is that I'm getting more obstreperous. I'm now developing ways of trying to reach very large audiences of people to say, look, we got a problem here. And I may not have it all right, but it's very clear that greenhouse gases are physically impossible. It is physically impossible for greenhouse gases to cause the warming that we've observed. The world has been warming, and we know how that warming has occurred, but that warming, the timing of that warming, the details of that warming don't agree with the changes in greenhouse gases, and they just can't be correct.
Yeah, so even the correlation is wrong.
Well, it's a really interesting problem. You know, I mean, Mark, I understand you've worked on a number of products, trying to get a product out. And this is what I'm doing here. I'm trying to get a scientific product out and get people to listen to it. And the fact that I'm a minority of one person, it's easy for people to dismiss it.
Have you recruited anyone in the science community to agree with you?
There are a number of scientists who like what I'm doing. There are a number of scientists who question greenhouse gases and other things, and they're glad to see the work I'm doing. But in terms of scientists who are writing the IPCC reports, who are writing the national reports in the United States, who are part of what we would call a consensus, I have not been able to get any of them to step back and read carefully what I'm saying. I submitted a paper recently to the Journal of Geophysical Research Atmospheres, which is the lead journal in the United States in this field. It was rejected for non-scientific reasons without review. I've distributed copies of that rejection and of that paper. I'm the only scientist I know in the world who has set up a booth at professional meetings in the exhibit hall where they normally exhibit equipment. I've set up a booth now at 12 national, international meetings where for 4 or 5 days I talk to scientists about my ideas about global warming and about how the Earth gets warm. I have a very provocative booth exhibit, which draws people in. At the American Geophysical Union meeting last December, 660 people stopped by the booth. We talked, some very argumentative, some more interested in listening. I sold over 20 books at that meeting. I've now talked to over 6,000 scientists at professional meetings over the last several years. And I've got a lot of people interested. I've got a big email list. But in terms of somebody who's well known, standing up and saying, you ought to listen to this guy, I have yet to get anybody to do that. I can't even get invited to speak at the universities. For example, the one where I got my PhD. I've offered to come for free and just explain what's going on. In terms of other universities, I've offered to show up for free. I want to talk to people that want to listen. I want to discuss.
Well, you certainly have this audience that is open to you. Chuck, this reminds me of something you and I did years ago. I remember talking to a very powerful political leader about the need for term limits. Mm-hmm. And this particular leader told me, I completely agree with you. Term limits is one of the major things we need to fix Washington, but I will never admit it if you ever say I said that, because I could never say that in public.
Yeah, it's fear. It's fear. And that's all. It's fear of the truth, oddly enough. And the fear of losing money, the fear of losing your own prestige, the fear, it's just amazing. But, I guess with tenacity, Peter, you'll win out eventually. It has to happen. If you're right and they're wrong, eventually that has to come to light. Then you'll be a hero.
Dr. Ward, what can our audience do to help? What can they do to help you?
I'm more than happy to speak just about anywhere I can, by radio, by television. I have a media office that sends out announcements of things I can speak about on a regular basis. I've done over 100 radio shows in the last year and a half. I'm more than interested to speak to groups that want to listen, that want to have a discussion. I've offered many different ways. The other most important thing is for people to ask questions. What do you think about this? You go to physically-impossible.com. What's wrong with it? This guy seems to make sense. I am getting more and more email now from people saying, you're beginning to make sense. You're making more sense than a lot of these other people. And I see that as a real victory. I feel in the last few months that I'm beginning to see the slow increase of an exponential curve. And that means that there's a small change, and I think I'm going to get there, and I hope I'm going to get there in my lifetime. But there was a famous meteorologist, Alfred Wegener, who back around 1917 or so said, look, Africa and South America fit together. They must have drifted apart. And he wrote a book, and he put out a lot of information, and all the geologists were saying, no way, continents can't move. There's no way that could happen. And he died, and 20 years after his death or whatever, we discovered that's what was really happening. Well, many people have pointed out that he was a meteorologist telling the geologists that they were wrong. Peter Ward is a geologist telling the meteorologists that they're wrong. It's only symmetry.
Interesting.
Well, Doctor, we are here to support you. We will have links to Dr. Ward's website where you can learn more about his work. You have a book available too, right?
What Really Causes Global Warming, readily available on my website, whyclimatechanges.com. Also available at Amazon and other places. I wrote the book with the general public in mind. I tried not to make it too scientific, but I explained a lot of science in a great deal of detail.
So, folks, I recommend you go to the website. I've read it. To me, it's really easy to understand. I guess I'm an engineer, so I have a little bit of a jump there, but I think it's pretty easy for people to understand. It makes sense. And what I would say to people, Chuck, is go challenge people with this information. When somebody tells you greenhouse gas is the problem, take them to that website and tell them, prove that wrong to me. Show me where it's wrong.
Yeah.
And furthermore, send an email to me and tell me what's wrong. I'm open to anybody telling me what's wrong. I don't think they're going to be successful. You know, in 2015, I offered, and I'm still offering, $10,000 to the first person that can do an experiment that demonstrates that increasing greenhouse gases causes warming of the amount that we've observed in the last several decades. $10,000. I'm going to give it to you out of my children's inheritance if anybody could show that. Now, the reason I make that offer is I'm convinced nobody could show that. The physics is wrong. But anyway, I put that challenge out there. And the fact is, most people have ignored that challenge. Nobody stood up to it. One person, the first thing that happened was one person sent me the website address of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And then he said, send money here. And I wrote back and said, no, you got to do an experiment, because nobody's ever done that experiment. It has never been shown by experiment that increases in greenhouse gases can cause global warming.
You know, last time I'm going to ask you, you worked on a committee with Al Gore, right?
Yes, I did. I worked on a committee for Al Gore. I never was working with him personally, but I was working for his chief of staff and one of his major right-hand men.
So I would have to believe you're kind of persona non grata around Al Gore.
Well, actually, a few years ago, I tried to get the word to Al Gore that the science was changing. He has a committee of scientists that advise him, and they're all convinced that I'm wrong. And there's just no one there. You know, they're not listening.
So he has a consensus of scientists. He has a group of yes men that agree with him.
No, he has had for a long time half a dozen to a dozen scientists who are good scientists, and they honestly believe that greenhouse gases are the cause. And they're delighted to provide him with the information. And he has done, I think, a fairly good job of communicating the science as those scientists see it to the public. The fact that he's of one Democratic Party has gotten to be more political, but he has tried hard to communicate the science as the science is understood by the scientists. What I'm saying is turns out the science is a mistake.
And he has amassed $100 million in that communication process.
Well, he's invested, just like everybody else that believes that, in ways that he thinks are going to pay off as the world warms. And, you know, I think one of the problems with the climate wars is there's been a lot of knocking people down because of what we think of what their motivation is. The fact of life is the scientists are convinced that greenhouse gases are the cause of the warming, and the majority of scientists are turning out to be wrong, mistaken. They've just got the wrong science.
And that is the history of science. The history of science is consensus until it's proven wrong.
It really is. And, you know, Carl Sagan, the famous communicator of science, he said, there are many hypotheses in science which are wrong. That's perfectly all right. They're the aperture to finding out what's right. Science is a self-correcting process. I am trying to correct science. I am one lone wolf against a world of very good scientists. I happen to have a strong scientific background with a great deal of experience. And for that reason, a lot of people say, well, it's hard to dismiss him, but I still haven't gotten them convinced. The science is wrong. It's that simple. It's a mistake.
Climate change.
Ignore him.
Well, climate change, Chuck, it's not about science anymore. Climate change has become a religion.
Yeah.
Well, it's become a political football. And
it's a belief system now, though. It's a faith. It's a belief system.
Well, this is the problem with trying to get a consensus. Science is not done by consensus. You know, it's just simply it's a major mistake. You know, it's Michael Crichton had a lot to say about that.
Boy, did he ever. I read his book.
You know, he said, I want to pause here on his talk he gave, and he says, I regard consensus science as an extremely pernicious development that ought to be stopped cold in its tracks. Historically, the claim of consensus has been the first refuge of scoundrels. It is a way to avoid debate by claiming that the matter is already settled. Whenever
Yes.
you hear the consensus of scientists agrees on something or other, reach for your wallet because you're being had.
And that is the term that we hear from the left oftentimes. It's settled science.
The science is settled. Now, I have a nonprofit corporation in Wyoming. Science is never settled. And that is my message. Science, and no good scientist will ever disagree with that.
What I can never understand is why this is settled science, but what gender you are is still in some type of fluidity at the moment.
Well, when the egg is fertilized in the womb, it's not male or female. It's bipotential.
Agreed, but there's this whole XY chromosome thing that takes place.
Well, it gets down to chemistry and testosterone and other things. It'll become a woman unless testosterone or other things take over.
But it's
And
apparently
so
not settled science.
Well, no, actually, the science is pretty settled. It's just that it's the result of that conversion from being a nothing to either male or female that can vary, and it doesn't always work out perfectly.
It is amazing. Doctor, it has been terrific having you with us. I hope that you will come back and share more of this information and let us know how your battle to tell the truth is doing. And folks, remember, we'll have links to all of Dr. Ward's information in the show notes at bluntforcetruth.com.
Thank you, Dr. Ward. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Mark and Chuck. It's been a real pleasure.
And we'll see you all next time on Blunt Force Truth.